Hello, and welcome to session 1.3 of Jesus and the Magic Money Tree. Borrowing from the future. Where does money come from? Sneak preview, it doesn't grow on trees. It's even weirder than that. In this session, what we'll find as we explore the origins of money is that borrowing and lending, which featured prominently in the second session, crop up again in a crucial way. And this in turn will oblige us to think about the phenomenon of interest on loans, and in particular the way in which compound interest works. This turns out to be fundamentally important in shaping the kind of economy we have. But to begin with, let's recap. What did we learn last time? Well, that there are three ways of understanding what money is. A commodity, representing the value of other useful things. A relationship of credit and debt between people, and whatever the government will accept as tax. And money does three different things too. It acts as a means or medium of exchange, it provides a store of value, and it provides a unit of account. And we notice that a single money system can struggle to do all these three things well at once. So, our first question today is this. When your high street bank makes you a loan, where does the money come from? Is it A, money deposited in the bank by other people and companies? Is it B, money lent to the bank by the Bank of England? Is it C, dividends from Queen Anne's bounty, a sum of money invested by Queen Anne in the East India Company in 1710? Is it D, created out of thin air by the bank? Or is it E, from Jeremy Corbyn's Magic Money Tree? The answer is D. The money is created out of thin air by the bank. The roots of this practice lie in the early 17th century. At that time, goldsmiths had become very significant figures because people used to deposit their gold, silver, and other valuables with them for safekeeping in their vaults. The goldsmiths would issue deposit receipts in return, and these deposit receipts were a form of IOU. Three hugely important developments followed from this. First, over the course of time, people began to accept these deposit receipts, or IOUs, as a form of cash, or means of exchange in everyday purchases, rather like an endorsed cheque. Second, goldsmiths came to realize that they could lend out some of the gold and silver coins they held on deposit and charge interest to the borrowers in doing so. Now, this could be very profitable, especially as loans were made on the basis of compound interest. More of that anon. And finally, the goldsmiths also realized that since their deposit receipts were now being used widely as cash, borrowers would be prepared to accept loans issued in the form of these receipts, rather than insist on gold or silver coinage. As a result, goldsmiths were able to loan out receipts for more coinage than they actually held. After all, who would know the difference? Provided people trusted the goldsmith, that is, they believed that he held enough hard currency in the form of gold and silver to cash in a given receipt, everyone was happy. These are the origins of fractional reserve banking, the practice of lending out more money, effectively in the form of IOUs, than you actually hold. This extra money is created out of thin air. Banks, the present-day equivalents of goldsmiths, literally have a license to print money. So, for example, At the time of the 2008 financial crash, commercial banks held just £1.25 in central bank reserves for every £100 loaned out to customers. If you think that's rather extraordinary, you wouldn't be alone. Some interesting quotes here. The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. The process by which banks create money is so simple, the mind is repelled. It is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning. Here's another question for you. In 1694, a group of wealthy merchants lent King William III of England, William of Orange, £1.2 million to spend on war against the French, repayable at 8% per annum. What were the king's creditors allowed to do in return? Was it A, to drive their sheep and cattle across Tower Bridge, B, to use Buckingham Palace as a venue for garden parties, C, to nominate the Prime Minister, or was it D, to create their own private bank with unique public privileges? The answer is D, to create their own private bank with unique public privileges, the Bank of England. As anthropologist David Graeber puts it, they received a royal monopoly on the issuance of banknotes. What this meant in practice was that they had the right to advance IOUs for a portion of the money the king now owed them to any inhabitant of the kingdom willing to borrow from them, or willing to deposit their own money in the bank. In effect, to circulate or monetize the newly created royal debt. This is why Bank of England notes still bear the legend, "I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of." It's a mere IOU in essence, and so reflects a relationship between people. The chief cashier representing the Bank of England, and so the state's creditors, those from whom the state has borrowed, and finally, the bearer of the IOU, you or me. This reflects the credit theory of money, whereby money simply means a social bond of credit and debt. Money doesn't have any value in and of itself, it's just a claim on the wealth of others. That's why it can take the form of a piece of paper, or increasingly these days, just a number stored in a computer somewhere. David Graeber goes on, to this day, the founding loan of the Bank of England has never been paid back. It cannot be. If it were, the entire monetary system of Great Britain would cease to exist. Here's an interesting perspective on the context in which the Bank of England got founded. This is a graph of English gross domestic product per head of population, or GDP per capita, between 1270 and 1850. We'll be exploring GDP in more depth later on, but for now let's just take it as a rough indicator of average national income. Notice that up until the mid-17th century, the trend of the line is flat, apart from a step change around 1350, which probably has something to do with half the population dying of the Black Death. But then, around about 1660, per capita GDP starts to rise quite steadily. In fact, the average annual growth rate between 1660 and 1704 was around 1.5%. In historical terms, that's substantial. In other words, the country was getting steadily better off as time went on. People began to expect that there'd be more money around next year than there is now. And that's an excellent climate for investors, those who can afford to lend some of their money to others because they can be pretty confident that borrowers will be able to afford a decent rate of interest on their loans. And in the case of the 1,272 people who together raised over £1 million to lend to the government, they were content to lock up their capital in the Bank of England, for good potentially, in return for that tasty 8% per annum in interest, courtesy of the English taxpayer. Notice, though, that all this coincided with the start of a period of steady economic growth, a topic to which we will return. Next question. How much of all the money in circulation in the UK today was produced by the Bank of England? Is it 3%? Is it 10%? Is it 51%? Or is it 100%? The answer is just 3%. This includes cash, notes and coins, and so-called central bank reserves. These reserves are electronic money created by the Bank of England mostly as loans to the government and other commercial banks. The rest of the money in the economy, some 97%, has been lent into existence by high street and other commercial banks as interest-bearing debt. This is known as commercial bank money. And here's a graph of cash and central bank reserves, so-called base money, and broad money, the totality of all the money in circulation in the UK between 1964 and 2011, all corrected for inflation and at 2012 prices. Just ponder that graph for a moment. It really speaks for itself. Just in case you don't believe me, then ask a 10-year-old. Please pause the presentation here and watch this short video from Positive Money. The link and a transcript are available on the Jesus and the Magic Money Tree webpage for this session. Let's look a little more closely at what's going on here. When a debt is repaid, that money ceases to exist again. It simply vanishes. But the interest paid to the bank by the borrower doesn't disappear. That stays in the economy. This is the profit made by the bank on the loan, and it's why it made the loan in the first place. Let's imagine a bank makes a loan to a business. The business does what businesses are meant to do and turns that sum of money into a bigger sum of money. Now that increased sum is made up of three parts: the original loan, the interest payable to the bank, and the net profit remaining for the business. When the time comes for the loan to be repaid, the first of these, the money loaned, just disappears. But it does leave a trace in the form of the other two parts, the interest and the profit in the economy. Of course, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. Imagine again that I'm in a business borrowing money in a growing economy. That is, one in which the amount of money in circulation is increasing all the time. Or, if you prefer, where the size of the overall pie is always getting bigger. In this situation, I can pay the loan back plus interest and also make a profit without anyone else needing to be worse off. In this example, although everyone else's share of the pie shown in yellow here, has gotten smaller, in absolute terms, it's bigger because the size of the overall pie has grown. But what if the economy isn't growing and the pie stays the same size? In this case, even without my making any profit for myself, my interest payments mean that someone else somewhere has to be worse off. This is shown in this example by there being less yellow in the second circle. And what we have here is known as a zero-sum game. For every winner, there has to be a loser. So we can see why, with the present money system, people are so keen to see economic growth. Okay, so having noted that money is loaned into existence as interest-bearing debt, let's think now about how interest actually works. In this regard, we need to notice the huge difference between simple interest and the interest that actually applies in the real world, compound interest. Here's the difference. Imagine you borrow £100 at a rate of, say, 10% per annum. With simple interest, working out the total debt outstanding after a year, 2 years, and so on is easy. It just depends each time on the size of the initial loan, or principal, as shown here. So after a century, your total debt would be the initial £100 plus 100 times 10% of that £100. In total, £1,100. But with compound interest, the amount owed after each year depends not on the principal, but on the amount outstanding at the end of the previous year. So, after 1 year, the total is 10% of £100, 110, the same as under simple interest. But at the end of the second year, the total debt increases not by 10% of 100, but by 10% of 110, leading to a total of £121. So, as you can see, already the debt is greater than the 120 owed under simple interest. And this trend continues with each passing year. Under compound interest, the additional debt incurred every year is greater than that of previous years. So that, in this example, after a century, you'd be more than £1 million in debt. Here's a graph which illustrates this difference schematically. As time on the horizontal axis passes, simple interest increases in a nice straight line. But compound interest follows what's known as an exponential curve. And with an exponential curve, the slope of that curve depends on how far up the curve you are, so that the higher you get, the steeper the slope becomes, until eventually it's very nearly, but not quite, vertical. Now for an example which illustrates how exponential growth works. Please pause the presentation again here to watch this short clip from Chris Martinson's Crash Course video series. Again, the link and a transcript can be found on the Jesus and the Magic Money Tree webpage for this session. It's hard to believe, isn't it? But if you're interested, I've replicated that calculation for Wembley Stadium and put that up on this session's Jesus and the Magic Money Tree webpage. Surprising, but true. So let's look now at another random illustration of compound interest in practice. If, instead of throwing them back at the chief priests and elders, Judas Iscariot had invested his 30 pieces of silver in an ISA, paying the modest rate of 1% per annum in interest, how much would his estate be worth today? Would it be £3 million? Would it be £3 billion? Would it be £3 trillion or £3 zillion? The answer is £3 trillion. There is, of course, no such number as a zillion. Now, the piece of silver which Judas dealt with on that occasion was probably a 4-drachma coin. The Greek drachma was equivalent to a Roman denarius, roughly a day's pay for a manual worker in Jesus' day. Now, assuming that we can equate this to the 2018-19 UK minimum wage for 21 to 24-year-olds, that means that Judas betrayed Jesus for about £7,000 in today's money. Invested back in around about 30 AD, thanks to the miracle of compound interest, even at only 1% per annum, this would amount today to a sum in excess of the UK's annual gross domestic product. Now, this compares with the mere 142,000 which would have been produced by simple interest. This is because with compound interest, as we noticed, the interest is added to the principal at the end of each year, so that a constant rate of interest means that more and more is added in interest with every year that goes by. By now, you might well be wondering, can the exponential growth that goes with compound interest continue indefinitely? Well, the answer is, it can't. In the memorable words of economist Kenneth Boulding, anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. Which seems an apt moment to reflect on some of Jesus' teaching. Please turn to Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 to 9, and read this well-known parable through slowly a couple of times. Then have a go at answering these questions. In what ways can growth go wrong? What are the signs of good growth? And which of these scenarios in Jesus' parable most reminds you of exponential growth? And why? Pause the presentation now while you're doing this. Growth, according to Jesus' parable, can go wrong in many different ways. By not getting started in the first place because of outside interference from the birds in the case of the parable, and by not developing deep enough roots, by being stifled. Good growth is marked by gradual increase, leading to the end of growth as such and the production of a prolific crop. That, after all, the production of the crop was the point of the growth all along. Perhaps the closest analogue to exponential growth is the seed that fell on rocky ground and so sprang up quickly. But rapid, rootless growth led to burnout and the failure to produce any crop. This kind of growth is unsustainable and ultimately fruitless. In the next session, we'll be looking at economic growth more closely, and especially the difference between good growth and bad growth. And we'll also begin to consider some other ways of assessing how well off we really are. But for now, what have we learned in this session? Well, that commercial banks create money out of thin air. That the Bank of England was founded partly in order to make money for private lenders. That almost all the money in the economy exists because someone somewhere has gone into debt and is paying interest on it. And with compound interest, the additional amount owed increases with every passing unit of time. This is exponential growth. And finally, in this kind of system, the whole economy has to grow exponentially if one person's gain isn't to mean another's loss. So join me again for session 1.4 of Jesus and the Magic Money Tree. Growing, growing, gone. How well off can we get?